between the Indo-Pacific and Europe. I think fundamentally China will see this as creating something of a distraction for the United States, which it will redound to China's benefit at some level in the Indo-Pacific. Just the kind of having some amount of credibility will really be essential, but you have to balance that, of course, with the level of resources devoted to each region. So it's really about trying to keep that upholding norms and then getting the resource balance right. So I think we will have to still lean toward the Indo-Pacific, but we can't abandon Europe either, certainly not now.
Lisa, let me go to you on the India question. So India has raised a few eyebrows in Washington and elsewhere, presumably, by voting not to condemn Russia's actions at the UN, but rather to abstain. So the same position that China and other countries have taken, different than the other 3 members of the Quad who all voted to condemn China's actions, and has declined to participate in the sanctions that, again, the Quad members and many others have put into place. So why do you think this is the position that India has taken on this? And do you expect this to cause any friction or turmoil in the Quad or in the US-India relationship over the long run? Or is this just kind of a difference of opinion on the matter at hand?
Well, thanks, Richard. And it's great to be here with the other distinguished panelists. So I think from India's perspective, they have 2 major concerns. One being that they rely on Russian military equipment. For 60 to 70% of their military needs, they rely on spare parts, maintenance. So that's a concern. And particularly at this time in the springtime, as the snows are melting and China could choose to put pressure on India's border. We saw nearly 2 years ago with the 2020 Gawan border crisis, the first time ever you had loss of life in an India-China border clash, 20 Indian soldiers dying in that clash. So India has real clear and present concerns. And so, the last thing they want is to go up against Russia and get into some kind of border crisis with China, and then Russia cuts off military supplies. So that's India's perspective. So there are real concerns there. But I think that when it comes to really relying on Russian support in its conflict with China, India may be miscalculating, because Russia under Western sanctions is going to become even more dependent on China. Russia's already the junior partner to China in that partnership, and that's just going to grow as Russia falls under the heavy Western sanctions. So I don't think India can necessarily count on strong Russia support, or Russia being able to persuade China to back off from encroaching on Indian territory. But I think that what we've seen from the administration is a restrained reaction to India. And I think that's because the U.S. does see the most important long-term challenge coming from China, coming from the Indo-Pacific, and it's relying on India playing a strong role in the Indo-Pacific, and it's relying on the Quad. If you look at the White House Indo-Pacific strategy, which was released February 11th, just 1 week after the Russia-China manifesto was issued, it's clear that the Quad is going to play a central role in the administration's Indo-Pacific strategy. So I think, the idea is that if we can see India playing a strong role in the Indo-Pacific, that makes it easier to, accept its very controversial stance on Russia. And I think, in fact, the reason for holding the SNAP Quad summit last week was to demonstrate that there was still unity within the Quad. It also allowed India to be able to explain its position behind closed doors with the other Quad leaders. And it allowed them to publicly highlight that they all remained committed to the Quad grouping, despite these differences over Russia. So again, I think that the administration is taking the long view. It knows India will be important against the greatest long-term challenge, which is China. And so it's been willing to not be overly critical of India's position. However, when it comes to the sanctions waiver for India's purchase of the Russian S-400 missile defense system, I don't think there are any real guarantees. Even before Russia's invasion of Ukraine, the administration had not decided whether they would in fact issue a waiver for India. And certainly I think that's become a bit more difficult. Our congressional leadership will have an opinion on the matter. So that could be more difficult for India to obtain that waiver for its purchase of the S-400.
In just a minute, Tobias, I want to come to you on Japan. But just before I do, I want to go to Ashley on this India question too. If you have a view, so one, you generally agree with with what Lisa put forth as the motivation of New Delhi in terms of the position it's established, or is there also some kind of lingering non-alignment, stuff going on here too? And then also in terms of the U.S. reaction, I mean, should it basically be that, as the administration is very critical of China, the way it's voted to abstain at the UN. So it's bad when China votes that way, but if India votes that way, we kind of understand that, and it's okay.
Well, there are several issues implicated here. Let me start with, I agree with what Lisa described as India's constraints, and those I think accurately reflect the calculations of the government of India in particular. I mean, they found themselves, the Modi government found itself between a rock and a hard place because it certainly does not like what Putin did. And if you read their explanation of the vote of abstention, they clearly convey their discomfort with what Putin did. Unfortunately, that discomfort was conveyed, I think, a tad too subtly. And therefore, the explanation was overwhelmed by the fact of the abstention itself, as one would expect. But there is a sentiment which is a little more disturbing, and you see that among many Indian strategic elites who have actually gone out of their way to finger the United States as essentially being the cause of the problem. By pointing out that we brought the Russians to this pass because of all the decisions we made with respect to NATO expansion going back many years. And the fact that we were unwilling to publicly declare that Ukraine was not a candidate for NATO membership. They wanted us to publicly declare that in the hope that, that might have given Putin pause. So there is clearly a sentiment in India. I think what the Biden administration has done, as Lisa pointed out, is that it has not put much stock by way of consistency in Indian policy. So it's happy to live with the fact that India is committed to the rules-based order in the Indo-Pacific and, has been less than a vocal supporter of the rules-based order in Europe. I mean, that inconsistency, I think, has been digested for pretty much the reasons that Lisa laid out, which is there is a cold calculation that while we would have liked India to be part of the Western coalition condemning Russia, at the end of the day, India's relevance to the outcomes in Europe is marginal, whereas India's relevance to the outcomes in the Indo-Pacific is potentially substantial. And so I think the administration did not want to forsake the bird that they had in hand for simply a hypothetical benefit, lying out there in the bush. And I think it was the right call.
Yeah, no, that makes total sense. Tobias, you've been patient, and I want to interrogate you on Japan a little bit. One, how much of a Rubicon do you think Tokyo has crossed in its reaction here. I mean, these sweeping sanctions, which is not always Japan's favorite thing to do, and not for something that is an acute threat to Japan. How do they kind of interpret this, and how much of this is prologue to what China might do in Taiwan and all this? And so maybe answer that, and then I want to ask you about Prime Minister Abe's nuclear sharing comments.
Sure. So I put on Twitter the other day that that the Kishida government has now unwound basically 10 years of Japanese Russia policy in 10 days. That and you look back at 2014, there was real reluctance to sanction Russia. What you ended up getting, I mean, slap on the wrist would be a generous way of describing what the Abe government did in 2014. And there was a reason for it. If you look at their 2013 national security strategy, the section on Russia was all about opportunities for cooperation, seeing opportunities for strategic cooperation in the interest basically of reducing security threats in Russia and Japan's near and broad. Basically, recognizing that the military balance with China was changing. If China was a threat, that if they could find a way to reduce the threat that Russia might pose to Japan, if you could find a way to find new areas for economic cooperation, energy cooperation, basically finally reach a peace agreement and a territorial agreement, that all of that would improve Japan's security situation. And so you ended up really with Abe investing a lot of time trying to forge a relationship with Putin. They met time and time again. He was very quick to resume meetings after the annexation of the Crimea. And that was really the driving, the motive force for Japanese Russian policy throughout the Abe period and then into the Suga years. And even, as of kind of the end of last year, Kishida was still at least paying lip service to it, that he wasn't giving really a definitive answer, but certainly hadn't signaled that he was going to break decisively with it. And I think right up to the eve of the crisis, it was really hard to know just how Japan would break. I mean, I wrote a paper in February suggesting the Biden administration shouldn't overlook Japan and South Korea, but I kind of soft pedaled the recommendations because I thought, well, it might not be exactly like 2014, but they do have a history of not necessarily wanting to do heavy sanctions. That has not been the case. I mean, they signed on, sanctioning the Bank of Russia, export controls, which, given, Japan's participation in that is, I think, a really big deal. Freezing Vladimir Putin's assets and other, Russian oligarchs in ways that they didn't back in 2014. You've had major assistance announced for Ukraine, both humanitarian assistance and non-lethal military assistance, so sending body armor for the Ukraine military. That's a really big step for Japan to take. And you basically, I think, have had essentially a declaration from Kishida that the Abe Russia policy is over. He said, we're not, that in these circumstances, we cannot negotiate with Russia about the status of the disputed islands in the Kuril Island chains that they've been disputing since 1945. We can't have those negotiations anymore. It's unfortunate, but we can't do it, the way things stand right now, that there's really not a path forward. So you're sort of in terra incognito as far as Japan's Russia policy is concerned. We don't really know where they go from there, but in signing on to all these sanctions and basically saying, we recognize that this has implications for our security. We have to stand shoulder to shoulder with the U.S. and other G7 partners. Kishida has signaled that they're going to be doing something new with Russia. We just haven't quite figured out what that means yet.
And in other areas of potential terra incognita, so former Prime Minister Abe made some remarks about NATO-style nuclear weapon sharing between the United States and Japan, and basically said something along the lines of, when we're considering security, we can't let this be a taboo that precludes the discussion about these kinds of things. And of course, there's been a nuclear taboo that's precluded exactly that kind of discussion for a very long time, for obvious reasons. Now, Prime Minister Kishida quickly sort of, poo-pooed the idea that we're not going to do that. But of course, it's worth remembering that Abe is not just a former prime minister; he's still head of the biggest faction in the LDP, and has a lot of sway. So, what do you think this sort of amounts to? Does this sort of break open the debate, this sort of third rail debate in Japanese national security policy with respect to nuclear weapons?
Well, I mean, I think Abe certainly putting that out there with a prime minister who not only is from the LDP's most liberal faction, but then also is from Hiroshima. I mean, he had to know that he wasn't going to get a lot of mileage necessarily with the prime minister. But I think you have to look at it in the broader context of we're heading into a year where the Kishida government was going to be updating the national security strategy, was going to be updating the national defense program guidelines, was going to be coming up with a new midterm defense spending outlook. So we already knew we were going to have a big debate on national security. And so I think we have to look at it in the context of, how has the Russia's invasion of Ukraine really changed Japan, how Tokyo was looking at the security environment, and what does that make possible in that debate in a way that wasn't possible necessarily before. And I think there are a few ways we should think about this. One, as I mentioned earlier, where the 2013 national security strategy looked at reducing tensions or finding kind of a modus vivendi with Russia as a way of reducing a major security threat on Russia or on Japan's flank. Clearly, you can't make that assumption anymore. So the question is, how does then that factor in sort of the overall outlook for what Japan needs to do to defend itself? So that's already, I think, there's going to be pressure from certainly from Abe. I mean, we were ready even before the comments about nuclear sharing. We were already sort of hearing arguments in that vein. So I think we're going to hear more about that. Russia being a clearer threat to Japan means that we need to spend more. We need to be prepared to take on a more expansive role. So that's I think the first thing. I think the other question about what Abe was doing, is it a way of shifting the Overton window, so to speak? That you had a prime minister relatively dovish. He's made some signs. For example, during the LDP leadership campaign, talked about maybe being open to Japan acquiring strike capability. There's been there was a big increase in defense spending and a supplemental budget last year. So he's been sending signals. But does this shift where the center is on the debate on Japan, national security policies, essentially, so that Kishida could actually take what for him would be quite a hawkish stand, but still look relatively reasonable when compared to Abe and some of the more right-wing leaders in the LDP. And I think we have to look at that going forward. What position Kishida ends up taking. And I think the last thing to note, and the last thing to watch, and we're already, if you look at right-wing media in Japan, you're already seeing this, that I think you're going to have lots of people in Japan who look at what Germany has done and said, look, they recognize that the situation has changed and they made the decision, and we have to be able to do the same thing. And there's going to be, I think, a lot of pressure on Kishida from within the LDP to make that same kind of gesture, to really show that we recognize things are different. We can't just keep going the way we've been going, and that this the decisions that will have to be made as part of updating these documents later this year are a real opportunity to send that signal.
I just want to ask you one last question on this in terms of something you just said. So I think you were saying that the Japanese see a heightened threat from Russia now. And do they really see Russia's invasion of Ukraine telegraphing a heightened threat of Russia to Japan? Or can you explain some of this, including some of the nuclear remarks, as Russia wouldn't have invaded Ukraine if Ukraine had nukes, China won't invade us if we have nukes? And so if
in Japanese nationalists, particularly on the right, but it, kind of raising the question about, do we, it was nuclear sharing, but it was also, in a crisis, do we want to be dependent on a U.S. Can we depend on a U.S. security guarantee? Do we need to be able to do more, to deter threats to, in the event of a crisis? So I think there's definitely that. Not exactly explicitly, but certainly that was definitely part of the subtext. But I think some of it is, I think, I think Japan watched the joint statement between China and Russia with a lot of interest. I think there's been a lot of concern watching, what Russia's been doing to fortify its position in the Kuril Islands. I think just, joint exercises between Chinese and Russian aircraft, and, kind of around Japan. I mean, I think there's definitely concern that in the event of a crisis, that, Japan, instead of, not really having to worry about what Russia might be up to, that all of a sudden, you have, potential Russian activity, requiring Japan to concentrate on that as well. You've had this long-term shift over the last 10 or 15 years where Japan is going to try to move assets, instead of having forces deployed across the archipelago and having some in Hokkaido and having some further south, that they're going to try to move their forces so they could concentrate on defending their outlying islands. But if they can't rest easy and not worry about Russia, and if they have to think about what the military situation with Russia looks like, are they actually able to make that kind of shift that they've wanted to make for a long time? I think that might be where this starts becoming an issue.
Great. We have a question from Brian Burton, a former CNASer, who is tuning in. Is Russia's military underperformance in Ukraine causing countries like China and India to engage in any rethinking of the value of their relationships with Russia? Jake, maybe I can go to you on this, and you might speak both to the military underperformance and potentially the reduced value of having an ally whose military does not perform as well as everyone expected, or quasi-ally, I should say. But also having a quasi-ally that is being rapidly isolated by countries around the world that represent 50% of global GDP and is being cut off of most of the benefits of globalization and is being distrusted and essentially shunned, and therefore, and attempted to be weakened. So what do you think the thinking is in jourdng and I now about the clasping of hands in February between Xi and Putin?
Yeah, I think there is sort of a question about, does Beijing have some sort of buyer's remorse related to the set of events, especially in the order that they transpired? I think the most immediate piece of buyer's remorse they may have is the economic fallout in a very sensitive year for Xi Jinping as he seeks the third term in office, and the Chinese economy faces a number of existing headwinds, and then the kind of crackdown on tech, slowdown in the housing market, et cetera. So kind of a quick, an overall global slowdown and quick rise in commodity prices will definitely not be welcome this year, if it would be welcome any year. But I think more broadly, I'm not sure that China is as upset about the fact of the Russian invasion of Ukraine as it is, as Brian maybe is suggesting, by the fact that it hasn't gone the way the Russians promised it would. And so, and has apparently kind of convinced the Chinese that it would, if this had happened in the sense that the way the Crimea campaign happened, sort of quick and effectively militarily, I think the viewpoint, and especially if you didn't have the cohesive Western response, my sense is that in jourdng and I, there'd be a sense of respect for that, of being able to kind of neutralize the growing threat of U.S. alliances on your border through effective military action that has the effect of splitting your political adversaries or geopolitical adversaries in the region. And I think that touches on kind of a larger question or larger point about the durability of China-Russia relations. Ultimately, China's pretty sympathetic to Russia's concerns about, facing a wall of U.S. allies and partners. That's why they talk about being back to back in Eurasia, and so they, again, I think the kind of net effect for China geopolitically will be mixed, right? Certainly, it's probably not happy about having a partner who's under that amount of pressure. But at the same time, to the extent that it relieves pressure more directly on China, it's a net benefit. In addition, in the post-2014 era, in many important areas, Russia's weakness is China's gain. Right. Certainly, we saw that in energy, certainly to some extent in the technology sector. We saw a major gas deal signed when the two met at the Olympics, but we also saw, and more recently, that the two parties are undergoing negotiations for a much bigger deal that could have the effect of rerouting, basically laying the infrastructure to reroute European gas to China at presumably quite favorable prices for China. So I think the buyer's remorse is really about how it unfolded, not that China opposes Russia's strategic motivations for its actions.
Lisa, what do you think about the India part of that question? I mean, irrespective of the votes at the UN so far and the decisions on sanctions, I mean, do you see this changing the relationship between Russia and India in a significant way over the medium run here?
I don't think Russia's poor military performance would impact Indian decision making. I think, the Indians are probably looking at what China's doing, maybe if China's position shifted to being tougher toward Russia, India may slightly shift its position. But I think that, the other issue is the brutality against the Ukrainians. I think, that is definitely going to be hard for India to, sustain its position if, the Ukrainians are getting increasingly brutalized in Russian attacks. If you see more attacks, like I guess we saw today against hospitals or universities, that could definitely, because that could impact the Indian public thinking. And that, India is still a democracy, so that could impact some of what the government's doing or its positioning. So that's something to watch for. And I think we wondered, India had 20 Indian students there studying, most of them studying medicine in the Ukraine. And when one of those Indian students was killed last week in an attack on Kharkiv by Russian missiles, there was question for a moment, would this make Indian public opinion shift, pushing the government to take a tougher position toward Russia? However, that did not happen. But what you saw is the government doubling down to work with Russia to get Indian students out safely. I think there are still several thousand there. But one thing to watch is if the Indian students do get out, would that allow more space for the Indian position to shift? Because, right now the focus is on trying to work with Russia to secure their safety. So, these are things that could impact India's position. They seem to have weathered the worst of it, abstaining in the UN votes. So they've gotten through that. And really, I think it depends on the course of the war now. And one thing that we didn't talk about either is that in the medium to long term, India may value the fact that it can get sophisticated technologies from Russia that it can't get elsewhere. And, it may value that now, but in the medium to long term, it's going to be more and more difficult for India to rely on Russian military equipment because of the sanctions. It's going to be more and more difficult for them to purchase the technology restrictions that are coming on Russia. Russia's just not going to be a very valuable defense partner for India in the medium to long term. And I think they have to recognize this. And, perhaps to countries like France, Israel, and others. So I think that's more impacting Indian decision making rather than, whether or not Russia is being successful with its military campaign.
Ashley, certainly if you have another thought on this, but there's also a question I wanted to pose to you. Sebastian from the audience has a question about how China is viewing the global reaction to the invasion and whether the sanctions and unity would deter Beijing's ambitions, presumably with respect to Taiwan. And there's a lot of talk now about this as sort of a dry run for the Taiwan playbook, because certainly Putin appears not to have expected or appreciated the degree to which he would be subject to unified, quickly imposed, coercive economic and other measures. And so one could imagine Xi Jinping saying, wow, hold on, I got to hesitate before I elicit the same kind of global response. I've got more to lose than Putin has. On the other hand, you could see the Chinese saying, well, they just wouldn't do that to us, because the country sanctioning Russia, virtually none of them have Russia as their number one trade partner. And the countries that would have to sanction China would all have China as a top trade partner. And that's before you get to the financial side. And so the costs on the sanctioning countries or on the coercing countries or on the deterring countries would be far higher than for Russia. So how do you see, if you sort of transpose the one to the other, the lessons that we're drawing from here, how do you think that applies or doesn't in the China-Taiwan context?
So I think it's impossible for us from the outside to actually adjudicate the trade-offs in Xi Jinping's mind. My own instinct is that he would be reminded more clearly than before about the risks of what a potential invasion entail, despite the fact that the dependencies on China on the outside world are much greater than the dependencies on Russia. But to my mind, what this tells me is that the only way you reinforce deterrence between China and Taiwan is that you make certain that their defensive capabilities are increased. Whether those capabilities are increased unilaterally or through the assistance of the United States. That's the only thing that holds in balance the prospect that Xi will be deterred rather than sort of go forward faster, right? So that's what this story tells me, is that between nationalism on one hand, Taiwanese nationalism, and a capacity to resist China, those are the two variables that can increase the cost to China dramatically. And we are seeing this in Ukraine. That's what we need to do, because that's the only long-term solution. So that irrespective of what Xi thinks, objectively, we simply make it harder for him to pursue unification through force. I want to just add one thought on the issue that Lisa spoke to about India. Mm-hmm. The Indians have to reckon with the possibility that the spares that they depend on from Russia are going to be harder to get, particularly as the Russian military, if the Russian military stays bogged down and has to dig deep into its own inventories. And if Russian production cycles are really undermined by the sanctions regime that is unfolding before our eyes, then India's ability to benefit from that, especially if there are secondary sanctions, I think the costs to India derivatively are going to be much higher than they anticipated when this entire caper began. So, India does not find itself in a pleasant place, but it's really torn because it wants to maintain the relationship with Russia in order to ease Russian dependence on China. And yet that is the one variable where New Delhi is actually weakest, because it has very few cards to play. Because if Russia has to trade its relationship with India versus the relationship with China, I think we all know where it will come down. It's going to come down in favor of the relationship with China, because that is so much more important. So India plays a weak hand and unfortunately will have even less to show for it.
I would like the record to reflect the beginning of Ashley's wonderful answer, which one very, very rarely hears in discussions like this. What do we know about what is in Xi Jinping's mind? We can't say for sure. But here's how we should think about it anyway. So we need to put some of this in a brass plaque and hand it to you. I thought that was great. Instead of saying what she wants is, definitively.
Well, if I knew Richard, I would be picking stocks for your retirement account, and you don't want me to do that. I promise you.
Exactly. Let me go to Jake on the Taiwan question, and then Tobias, maybe you can come in on Japan's position on Taiwan and the sort of lessons it's drawing here too. So Jake.
Yeah, thanks, Richard. I think, pursuant to what do we know about Xi, one thing that we have seen about what does Xi and his inner circle know about the world is that there's probably some ideological blinders and or confirmation bias going on in how they assessed the likelihood of Russia's intervention in Ukraine. So, just sort of bracket that issue. But what they know and how they're interpreting global events is a major factor. What one takeaway should be for Beijing is that wars are hard, and that even a country that gets to start one at a time and place of its choosing doesn't ultimately get to control the outcome. And so this will be perhaps even more true for the PLA, China's military, than it will be for the Russian military, because the PLA hasn't fought a war since 1979. And so there are some real questions about real world sort of combat power. And in concrete terms for Beijing, a war in Taiwan could, in the best scenario from their perspective, result in a victory and kind of solidifying Xi's vision of a great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation. or perhaps more likely, it could be a disaster that shakes the foundations of CCP rule, or at least Xi's rule, as it's shaking the foundations of Putin's rule in Moscow. And so hopefully the war in Ukraine puts more focus, sort of as Ashley was saying, on that downside risk of aggression. Because I think the sense was in recent years, there's been a lot of focus on the potential upsides and diminution of the potential downside risk in Beijing. In terms of the military sort of takeaways, I think one thing we can know is that both the CCP, the Chinese Communist Party, and the PLA are learning organizations, right? And they went to school to counter the American way of war they saw in the Gulf War, in Bosnia, in Kosovo in the 1990s. And they're going to look at this war in Ukraine, and they're going to go to school on that too, and try to figure out what the mistakes Russia made and how to avoid them. And they're also going to go to school on, continue to go to school on the sanctions regime and other types of restrictions, such that if it does come to pass where a Taiwan contingency comes up or they decide to do it, they want to be ready for the mistakes that Russia made. So I think the flip side of that higher focus on the downside risk is the potential to see this as a dress rehearsal that one can learn from and gain confidence going forward. So I think that's an additional risk potentially in Beijing's mindset as they look at this, what this conflict means for their ambitions towards Taiwan.
Great. And Tobias, how is Japanese leaders thinking about Taiwan in light of Ukraine?
Well, a couple of things to say. I mean, I think first, when you looked at the debate kind of during the run up to this, kind of what newspaper editorials were saying, what Diet members were saying, clearly, what sort of example, if Russia were to invade without really paying any cost, what sort of example that would set for China? Clearly, that was a motivating factor in seeing the kind of response that we've seen from the Kishida government. I mean, I think the differences between 2014 and 2022 in terms of how the Japanese government is looking at the military balance and what sort of message it would send if Russia was able to invade without paying a price. I think that clearly weighed on the mind of Japanese decision makers. I definitely think it was a factor. And I think, it's too early to say what exactly this is going to mean for Japan providing support to Taiwan. But we've definitely seen in the last 2 years or so, clear steps by the Japanese government moving closer towards Taiwan, being more explicit about providing support in various ways. Of course, Abe is at the center of this debate as well. And, not too long ago, actually, it was the same TV appearance. He was calling on the U.S. to end all ambivalence about supporting Taiwan and to be very clear about supporting Taiwan. Previously he's been calling for the Japanese government to be more explicit about being involved in this role. There's been a lot of reporting about Japan and the U.S. Have military plans for what it would do in the event of a Chinese invasion of Taiwan. And so this is going to be, I think, just another impetus, another push in the direction of strengthening those ties. I don't think we're going to get a new declaration of a Japanese Taiwan policy tomorrow, but this is if there was any inertia, and I think there were concerns at the start of the year that because it's an anniversary year for Japan's relationships with the PRC, that you might have attempts to fix that. I don't necessarily think you're going to see that kind of focus. I think that the push towards finding ways for Japan to help Taiwan, both in peacetime and also in the event of a crisis, I think we're going to continue to see the Japanese government look for ways to do that.
Great. Lisa, one area we haven't talked about is Southeast Asia and the ASEAN countries. Have you seen a reaction or lessons here for how they're thinking about China, or for that matter, for how they're thinking about Russia, which has stepped up its engagement here and there over the past few years with ASEAN?
Yeah, Russia has definitely tried to step up its engagement in Southeast Asia to some degree. Trade levels are still very, very low, about 20 billion total trade from Russia with Southeast Asia compared to the US, 360 billion, China, 640 billion. But they do provide some military equipment to some of the Southeast Asian states. They provide a lot of support to Myanmar, to the junta there, especially since they took power last year. But I would say that the response has been varied among the different countries, but as a whole, as is, per usual, the ASEAN statement was really pretty weak. The ASEAN statement basically called for dialogue, called for a ceasefire, but it didn't mention Russia specifically. It didn't mention the word invasion specifically. But the country that I think deserves a lot of praise and that has had a very proactive response is Singapore. Singapore, made a statement. The foreign minister delivered a statement on February 28th to the parliament stating that its intention is to act alongside the like-minded partners to impose sanctions and restrictions against Russia. And the foreign minister went on to say that a country like Singapore, a small country, must stand up for the principles of sovereignty and independence, lest its own right to exist will be questioned. And I think he's absolutely right. What he's saying is, in a world where might is right, it's the smaller nations that suffer the most. So Singapore definitely deserves praise. Some of the other countries, Vietnam and Laos, abstained from the UN General Assembly vote seeking to condemn Russia. But Vietnam has a similar problem as India. Vietnam relies on 80% of its military equipment from Russia. So that's the constraint that it's facing. So yeah, I think, by and large, I think the Southeast Asian nations want to remain neutral. Europe's far away. They don't want to get involved. And I think there was a question earlier from Jerry asking, how is it impacting their vision of China? And I think that's right. I think they want to remain neutral. They don't want to do anything to provoke China. So they would just as soon, stay out as much as possible and not have to be involved at all, with the exception of Singapore.
Tobias, there's a question from Stafford. South Korea had its presidential election today. The conservative candidate, Yoon Suk-yeol, was elected. And where do you see the South Koreans, or I guess, how do you see the South Koreans shifting, both in light of what we're seeing in Russia, Ukraine, but also given the the new president who will be coming on deck? Sure.
So, to some extent, South Korea has been the reluctant U.S. ally in Asia. During the run-up, the Moon administration was very quiet and mostly was talking about the impact that an invasion could have on South Korea and its economy. But they've caught up. They've signed on to the export controls on semiconductors and advanced technology, which is, again, a very big step given what South Korea produces. They've signed on to financial sanctions. I think they have come around to recognize that as a leading democracy, they couldn't sit this one out, that they had to be active in some way. So we've seen that under an administration that in a lot of times has, despite its ambitions, often been focused on the Korean Peninsula. And now with now President-elect Yoon, you're going to get a new Korean administration that at least, you had as a candidate, Yoon was talking about South Korea being more active in the regional security environment, raising its voice in ways that he felt it wasn't doing under the Moon administration. He's, of course, less invested in talks with North Korea. He's expressed interest in joining the Quad. So potentially, I think there's a real opening now for South Korea to be more of a player, just sort of in the regional security environment as a whole. But I think, the Moon administration has laid the groundwork with its response to this crisis, eventually catching up. It laid the groundwork in the bilateral setting when Moon visited last year for his summit with President Biden. So there's a lot, I think, that Yoon's going to be able to pick up and run with. The one question about Yoon is just that, he's a novice in politics. He was a prosecutor before this. I think he's got some good foreign policy advisors, but we're going to have to see, just how quickly he kind of picks up the portfolio of being an international statesman. He's just completely untested, and so I think he's got some work cut out for him, I think.
In our just couple minutes remaining, I want to go back to the first question that I posed, and this is on U.S. policy and how it allocates its resources and approaches policies it has toward Europe and toward the Indo-Pacific. I mean, somewhere in the computers of the National Security Council staff, there is a draft national security strategy. And somewhere in the computers at the Pentagon, there's a draft national defense strategy. And reportedly, both of those strategies, as previously drafted, said China was the #1 long-term challenge to the United States, and that the Asia-Pacific or the Indo-Pacific is the #1 region. And and the general sense is we're finally going to pivot, finally, because we got out of those pesky wars in the Middle East that were so distracting. We're out of Afghanistan, Iraq, all this other stuff, and that was the big distraction. Well, in comes Vladimir Putin and Russia. So, how do you? I mean, this is a broad question, but maybe I could just go around to the four of you if you have a thought on it. How do we actually do this? Is it we increase the defense budget and there's more resources to parcel out for everything, or increase the international affairs budget? You still then have, policymaker time and diplomatic bandwidth. Is it that we double down on the newfound willingness of our European allies to get involved in their own security in Europe? So if we exclude the extremes of we do everything everywhere, or we abandon Europe and just say, good on you guys, good luck, but our business is in Asia. What is a sustainable approach that deals with this new geopolitical reality look like when you talk about American engagement in the Indo-Pacific? So maybe, Ashley, I can start with you, and then we'll kind of go around and then conclude.
I think there are 3 regions of the world where we simply cannot afford to be not involved. The Indo-Pacific, Europe, and the Western Hemisphere. I mean, those are our core interests because what happens in these regions of the world impacts our national security, without compromise, right? So we can discuss what the priority of all the other areas that I've left out are, and there will be, discussions about that. But we cannot maintain our hegemonic position in the international system if we cede any influence in these 3 areas to our adversaries. There will be internal discussions about how we prioritize resources within these 3 areas, and that's completely understandable. And we could imagine that our European partners will take the lead on in protecting Western European interests, but they can do so only if they have the backing of the United States, and only the United States has a variety of military assets that any European defense system is going to need, and the Europeans are not going to be capable of substituting for those assets in a hurry anytime soon anyway. So as long as we admit that at least these 3 regions of the world will continue to have or should have primacy in our strategic planning and in our defense planning, I think that's a first step. What I'm trying to get away from is the notion that preserving the American order requires extraordinary attention to the Indo-Pacific to the exclusion of everything else. I think that is simply untenable if we want to remain a hegemonic power. Now, if you want to become just another great power like many others, then you can afford to sort of get rid of commitments in different parts of the world. But if we want to maintain that unique primacy, and it's not just because of power, I think it's fundamentally because of preserving a liberal international order which serves our interests, then we cannot preserve that liberal international order if we do not protect these 3 regions of the world.
Lisa.
Yeah, I agree with Ashley. We don't have the luxury of sort of making a choice. Yes, China is the top foreign policy priority, but we can't choose to either face down Russian aggression or Chinese aggression. We have to be able to operate in different regions, and it's not all about military resources. We can learn to leverage our relationships and our alliances a bit better, leveraging our alliances in Europe when it comes to facing down Russian aggression, and leveraging our alliances and relationships in the Indo-Pacific when it comes to meeting the China challenge. So I think we can do a better job of working together with our partners, empowering them, giving them some of the resources they need. There is a way to, preserve the liberal order across the globe in a way that we are learning to work with other countries in a more effective way. So I think, that's my answer. We don't have the luxury of picking or choosing. And frankly, we should have learned from Afghanistan, right? There was this whole desire just to, completely turn our back on Afghanistan. That didn't work. And what we see is if we really are in this stiff competition with China, if we withdraw from other parts of the world, China's going to take advantage of that. Right. So, by virtue of the fact that we are in this competition with China, we have to be able to be a global power and to be able to leverage relationships and partnerships across the globe to our advantage.
Tobias.
I think, I think there's the military balance question, but I think, there's also, when it comes to, the U.S. being present in Europe and in Asia. I mean, I think we have to remember that in Asia, the competition is as much about the economic order and the future of, how is the region growing and who's financing its growth, particularly of middle income Asia. And that really is where the competition is. I mean, yes, there's the military balance. Yes, there's questions about the long-term future of Taiwan, and we can't forget those. But ultimately, I mean, I think we have to remember what U.S. engagement in the region has to first and foremost be. And thankfully, I think the Indo-Pacific strategy that was released just before the invasion, I think reminded, where the bulk of it was about political and economic engagement, with military engagement part of that. And that ultimately, I think, so we actually can do lots of different things. Yes, I think we have to be part of the military balance in Europe. I don't think we can walk away from that role, certainly not on a shorter time horizon, but that shouldn't preclude us from also being involved politically and economically in Asia, and then also looking to our partners more on the military questions as well. And I think, to the extent that we can, I mean, using this crisis as a wake-up call for partners like Japan, to really start thinking about what the military balance looks like and what can you do to help shift that in favor of the allies, in favor of those who want to uphold a liberal order. And so in that way, I think there really are opportunities about this, coming out of this crisis that could strengthen the U.S., or really the U.S. multilateral position, in the regions that Ashley identified really as the most critical regions.
And Jake.
Yeah, so I agree with almost everything that's been said so far. I would just add, I think the emphasis on consolidating the core alliances and partnerships, especially with fellow democracies, in Europe and in East Asia, really has to be at the heart of this strategy. For a long time, that is essential for sustaining and keeping the world safe for democracy at home, which should be a central focus of our foreign policy, if not the most important goal of that and keeping Americans safe. But secondarily, too often those alliances and partnerships as groups have been less than the sum of their parts. But if you add them up, and you can make them, ideally more than the sum of their parts, but at least equal to, if you've got the European Union working on these technological and trade standards, then you've got the world's largest economy. Right, even bigger than China. If you have the kind of tech democracies working on tech standards, then you can maintain that sort of primacy, or at least situations of strength, right, going forward. So I think it's really about keeping that kind of core set of democratic allies and partners, and then using that as an example of the kind of world order we want to build and sustain that can be competitive with China over time, but also that can outlast what is probably ultimately a pretty fragile, authoritarian system in China. We'll see how long. I don't think we shouldn't pursue regime change, in my view, in China as a goal. But I think in terms of a race who can maintain their system longer, I would bet on the democracies if we're really focused on sustaining our core advantages.
It seems to me, just as a closing thought, that there's one other potential wake-up call here, and that is for the West, which I would define broadly to include the countries in the Indo-Pacific that we're talking about, to discover how much power they have, how strong they actually are. I mean, a revisionist China that is putting pressure on the liberal international order is a very formidable challenger. When it adds to its sort of alignment, Russia, it is more formidable still. We are seeing, and we have seen over the past 10 days, how that still pales in comparison to the West working in unity. The West working in unity represents over half of the world's GDP. China's, a big percentage, but not anywhere close to that, and not when you add to Russia. Add all the military capability, way above this. They were able to bring the Russian financial system to its knees and produce a near default in days. The problem hasn't been a lack of power. It hasn't been a lack of capability. It hasn't been a lack of underlying strength. It's been a problem of common action. And this is showing in this horrible tragedy what could be possible if countries are willing to work together in defense of the basic rules, like you can't look over to your neighbor's territory and decide you would like to have some of that, and you're going to go in with violence and take it. Like, that doesn't work anymore. And those are the kinds of things that have now stirred the West to the defense of those kind of rules and the preservation of that order. And if it can find it within itself to continue to act, then, there is an opportunity here that may not have been fully realized even 2 weeks ago. So thank you all for joining. This has been a fantastic conversation. Ashley Tallis, Tobias Harris, Jake Stokes, Lisa Curtis, everybody who joined us today, thank you so much. We'll be back with more events such as and discussions about the war and its implications and so forth. But this was a very important one, and we're grateful for your time and insights today. So thanks very much.
Thank you, Richard. Take care, all of you.
Thank you.